Hello, my name is Isaiah Ross, and today I'll be focusing on institutionalized social injustices. Since the dawn of America, it has thrived on the blood and sweat of what formerly would be considered the proletariat, but now can best be described as the subproletariat. Within capitalism, the proletariat is simply the working class, the group who can be defined as capitalists. The subproletariat can best be described as the group economically below the proletariat, a group that makes an income less than necessary for ideal living conditions. As more and more members of the subproletariat are persecuted by systematic confinement and extraordinary, and in many cases, militarized policing, an examination of these practices is necessary to find the best way to counteract and prevent said practices. As an African American in today's society, I felt the need to fully understand the reasons and processes for the catastrophic events that I've seen consistently plague blacks and other impoverished groups. By focusing my research within the lenses of militarization of police against minorities and gentrification, much light has been shed on just how intended these practices are and just what drastic measures are necessary to end them. In the first part of my speech, I will describe two specific problems within our social and economic institutions. In the second half, I will focus on the reforms necessary to end these practices. The first problem I will focus on is rooted more socially, while the second more economic. Social injustice is seen through a social lens by examining the militarization of American cities. The militarization of American cities dates back to the 90s in New York under Rudy Giuliani's run as mayor, a period which was referred to as Giuliani time, and consisted of the dedicated persecution of any and all petty criminals who threatened the quality of life. The majority of the time, this meant the dedicated persecution of the groups described as the subproletariat earlier. This militarization of police against minorities can be seen in an extraordinary amount of instances today, such as the Eric Garner and Michael Brown cases. Nowhere is safe from this threat, as seen during the protests of formerly non-renowned Ferguson, Missouri, within which protests were met with military levels of response, such as tanks and full combat armor, which shouldn't be necessary for the exercising of the First Amendment right to assemble. The continuation of these practices could prove detrimental for all parties involved. As the subproletariat continues to face losses due to the criminalization of minorities and aggressive policing, tensions continue to rise. As tensions continue to rise, the need to assemble and protest becomes more and more clear. But if each attempt to assemble will be met with a militarized response, then the casualties shall only exponentially increase in number. Social injustice is seen through an economic lens through the practice of gentrification. Gentrification can best be described as reinvestment into undervalued urban neighborhoods, which leads to former residents forced exiled from their former homes as property values are increased and public housing is destroyed to make room for expensive condominiums and high-scale restaurants, for which the intended purpose is far from the original citizens of the area. Citizens begin to experience gentrification starting with New York around the 1950s. By holding blacks and impoverished groups together in low-income communities, as well as incorporating militarized police tactics into their day-to-day, they are left trapped within the temporary job sector, as well as contained within the physical geographic areas, as well as to keep members of the subproletariat together and separate from middle to upper class whites. These minority groups are used as holding spaces until the real estate economy sees fit to gentrify their neighborhoods. All of these practices are allowed and able to exist under the current umbrella of capitalism that we currently are within. Pittsburgh, for example, has extremely high levels of gentrification. The Pittsburgh neighborhood of East Liberty has had a complete class character change within the last 10 years, as locally owned businesses have been run out of business by the placement of larger corporations such as Target. We also see the destruction of schools and public housing in order to create the Bakery Square condominiums, which are completely inaccessible to the former residents of the area. Many believe that we currently live in a society where issues such as race are behind us. For example, such as the presence of a black man gaining the role of president. This point clearly follows no logical train of thought, because many important issues of race have occurred under President Barack Obama's presidency, such as the events surrounding both the Michael Brown case in Ferguson and the Eric Garner case in New York. Blacks and other members of the subproletariat still find themselves under persecution regardless of the fact of a black president, meaning that these issues stretch further than his intention. Many claim that the presence of affirmative action in America negate any possibility of us living in a racial society. While the efforts of the EEOC have been commendable, explain this point to an incarcerated African American or Hispanic, a group that in fact makes up 58% of all prisoners in America, while at the same time equating to only about a quarter of the entire population. While I would like to advocate for the necessity of a full-fledged revolution, under the criteria of a 6 to 8 minute presentation that should perhaps be saved for another time, there still are reforms possible to counteract and eventually extinguish these practices. To directly combat the social issue of militarization of cities, we could reform the police department by limiting a police officer's jurisdiction to the community that they reside. This would prove positive because an officer's actions would directly affect the community that they live in, which would add a certain level of humanity that I think has been missed from the police department. The economic problem of gentrification can be counteracted by reforms in the real estate market, in which there is specific housing available for people with specific levels of income. These prices, once regulated, would not be changed and apply to all members of said districts or communities. This could definitely be a start to dismantling this problem as we head towards a true solution of releasing housing from market-based commodification and exchange. These reforms are revolutions in their own right, and are necessary for progression of America through the darkness that it has been encompassed in since its conception. The solidarity of American people is crucial to these changes. And Martin Luther King said it best in a commencement address to Oberlin College in June of 1965. There are all too many people who, in some great period of social change, fail to achieve the new mental outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. Thank you.